Hey, hi, hello there and welcome back to Formula Amateur, where today we are covering the final team in my brief history of series, and today we are talking about the last year's winners, McLaren. So let's get into it, shall we? So first, let's get into the background of the team. So the McLaren team founder was Bruce McLaren, who was from New Zealand and competed in Formula One during the 1958 to 1970 seasons. He started his own team, then called the Bruce McLaren Motor Racing Team in 1963, but sadly passed away in 1970 at the Goodwood circuit during testing. The team got on the grid as McLaren in 1966. So let's begin with the 60s. So when the team began, I presume the team principal was Bruce McLaren, who also drove for the team in 1966 and was the only driver that year. In 1967, he was also the only driver driving for the Bruce McLaren Motor Racing Team, but then in 1968 it was Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme. In 1969 it was Bruce McLaren, Denny Hulme and Derek Bell. And then we go into the 1970s. So in 1970s, as I said, in the first year Bruce McLaren actually passed away, but before he passed away he was still the driver of the team, along with Denny Hulme, and then Peter Gethin, Dan Gurney, Andrea Diadamic and Nanny Galli. And then the team principal from 1970 till 1982 was Teddy Mayer. In 1971 the drivers were Denny Hulme, Peter Gethin and Jackie Oliver. And then in 1972 the team changed to Yardley Team McLaren, and that year the drivers were Denny Hulme, Peter Revson, Brian Redman and Jody Scheckter. And then in 1973 they were Denny Hulme, Peter Revson, Jody Scheckter and Jackie Ickx. And then the team changed the name again to Yardley Team McLaren. Well, they were that team for a while, but during the year they changed the name to Marlboro Team Texaco. And in 74 the drivers were Emerson Fittipaldi, Denny Hulme, Mike Hayward, David Hobbs and Jochen Mass. And then in 1975, throughout the whole year and in 1975 actually, it was Marlboro Team Texaco and the drivers were Emerson Fittipaldi and Jochen Mass. And then in 1976 they changed the name again to Marlboro Team McLaren, so the McLaren team came back to the McLaren team. And then the drivers were James Hunt and Jochen Mass. And then in 1977 it was James Hunt, Jochen Mass, Bruno Giacomelli and Gilles Villeneuve. And then in 1978 it was James Hunt, Patrick Tambay, Bruno Giacomelli. And then they changed the name again to so they were briefly a Marlboro Team McLaren, and then they changed it to Lowenbrow Team McLaren. And in 1979 the team consisted of John Watson and Patrick Tambay. And now let's get into the 80s. And now we get into the 80s, where in 1980 the drivers were John Watson and Alan Prost and Stephen South. And then in 1981 the team was looked after in terms of team principal by Ron Dennis, who was there until 2009. So in 1981 the team also changed names to Marlboro McLaren International, and in 1981 the drivers were John Watson and Andrea De Cesaris. In 82 it was John Watson and Niki Lauda. In 83 it was John Watson and Niki Lauda again. In 84 it was Niki Lauda and Alan Prost. In 85 it was Niki Lauda, John Watson and Alan Prost. In 86 it was Alan Prost and Keke Rosberg. In 87 it was Alan Prost and Stefan Johansson. And then the team changed the name to Honda Marlboro McLaren. And in 88 it was Alan Prost and Ayrton Senna. And in 89 it was Ayrton Senna and Alan Prost again. And then we get into the 90s. And now we go into the 90s era. So in 1990 it was Ayrton Senna and Gerhard Berger. In 91 it was Ayrton Senna and Gerhard Berger again. In 1992 it was Ayrton Senna and Gerhard Berger again. And then in 93 the team changed its name to Marlboro McLaren. And in 93 the team was made up of Michael Andretti, Mika Hakkinen, Ayrton Senna. And then in 94 the team changed its name to Marlboro McLaren Peugeot, and they had Mika Hakkinen, Felipe Alliot and Martin Brundle. And then the team changed its name again to Marlboro McLaren Mercedes, and in 95 the team had Mark Blundell, Nigel Mansell, Mika Hakkinen and Jan Magnussen. And then in 96 the drivers were Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard. And then the team changed its name again in 97 to West McLaren Mercedes, where the drivers were Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard. And in 1998 it was Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard again. And then in 1999 it was also Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard. And then we go into the 2000s. And now we hop to the 2000s, where in the year 2000 the drivers were also Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard, and in 2001 it was the same case with Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard. But then in 2002 it was David Coulthard and Kimi Raikkonen. In 2003 it was David Coulthard and Kimi Raikkonen again, and in 2004 it was David Coulthard and Kimi Raikkonen yet again. And then the team changed its name, so halfway through 2005 they were West McLaren Mercedes, and then they changed the name to Team McLaren Mercedes. And in 2005 the drivers were Kimi Raikkonen, Juan Pablo Montoya, Pedro de la Rosa and Alexander Wurz. In 2006 it was Kimi Raikkonen, Juan Pablo Montoya and Pedro de la Rosa. And then the team changed its name yet again for the 2007 season to Vodafone McLaren Mercedes, and the drivers there were Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton, but all of their points were excluded and they were removed from the standings in terms of constructors due to legal reasons that I may or may not one day talk about. But it was due to a conflict of interest between it was a financial thing from what I understand at the moment, but we'll have a look into it in the future. And then in 2008 it was Lewis Hamilton and Heikki Kovalainen, and then the team principal in 2009 to 2014 became Martin Whitmarsh, and in 2009 the drivers were Lewis Hamilton and Heikki Kovalainen again. And now we get into the 2010s. Where the drivers were in 2010 Jenson Button, Lewis Hamilton, and then in 2011 the same, it was Jenson Button, Lewis Hamilton. In 2012 it was Jenson Button, Lewis Hamilton, and then in 2013 it was Jenson Button and Sergio Perez. And then the team changed its name again to McLaren Mercedes, and the drivers were Kevin Magnussen and Jenson Button. And then the team principal changed in 2014 to Eric Boulier, who was there until 2018. And the team changed its name again to McLaren Honda. So in 2015 the drivers were Fernando Alonso and Jenson Button and Kevin Magnussen, and then in 2016 it was Fernando Alonso and Jenson Button and Stoffel Van Dorn, and then in 2017 it was Stoffel Van Dorn and Fernando Alonso. And then the team changed its name yet again and has been the same name since until next year. And that's McLaren Formula One team. And in 2018 the drivers were Stoffel Van Dorn and Fernando Alonso. Then in 2019 the team principal changed yet again, and it was Andrea Seidel, and he was there until 2022. And so in 2019 the drivers were Carlos Sainz Jr. and Lando Norris. And now let's get into the 2020s. So in the 20s, specifically in 2020, it was also Carlos Sainz Jr. and Lando Norris. And then in 2021, it was Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris. In 2022, when Andrea Stella became the team principal and has been ever since, it continued to be Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris. And then in 2023, we had Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. In 2024, Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. In 2025, Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. And it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon. And now in 2026, the team is due to change its name yet again to McLaren MasterCard Formula One team. as the title sponsor being MasterCard. So that is all for McLaren. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Formula Amateur. Thank you so much for also listening to this series that I did on brief histories of different teams that are currently on the grid, from their beginnings whenever they were to their ends, or current where they are, and hopefully you will join me for more Saturday episodes, and we will have another exciting episode next Saturday, where we'll be talking all about the world champions by discussing who they were in a similar format to a brief history of, but in this case we are covering the last 75 years of world champions. So get ready for that. Don't forget that this week there is no race, so there will be no race rundown episode, but join me on Saturday for another exciting Formula Amateur episode. And after that we'll be talking about the Singapore Grand Prix. So all of that to come. Don't forget to check out my lovely colleagues on the Be the Change Media Network. Hope you have a lovely rest of your week, and I'll see you next Saturday. Goodbye.